The morning sun had barely climbed above the rooftops of a working-class neighborhood in Cleveland when the silence of the street broke under the low rumble of expensive engines. The block was the sort of place where families counted every paycheck twice and pickup trucks with faded paint sat in driveways beside dented garbage cans. Nobody on this street had ever seen a luxury car turn the corner. Not once. Then one came. Then another. Then another. Within the span of 2 long minutes, 20 black luxury cars rolled in single file down the cracked asphalt and parked along both sides of the road in front of a small wooden house with peeling paint and a sagging gutter. Curtains pulled aside in every neighboring window. An old woman across the street whispered to her husband that somebody on the block must have gotten themselves into very serious trouble. 3 children on their way to school stopped dead in their tracks, mouths fallen open, because none of them had ever seen so many luxury cars parked outside the home of a man who repaired refrigerators for a living. Inside that house, Caleb Morgan was buttering a piece of slightly burned toast for his 6-year-old daughter. He wore a faded gray t-shirt and old work jeans, his brown hair still tousled from the pillow. His daughter Lily sat in her booster chair, hugging a worn stuffed rabbit by the neck, asking whether they could stop by the library after school. Caleb was about to answer when the sound of engines outside made him stop mid-sentence. He set the butter knife down and crossed the kitchen in 3 quiet steps. He pulled the curtain back, and the muscles in his shoulders tightened in a way Lily had learned to recognize over the past 4 years. She slid down from her chair, clutching the rabbit a little tighter, and walked over to him. "Daddy," she whispered, peeking around his leg. "Are they coming to take us?" Caleb crouched down and forced a smile he did not feel. He smoothed her hair behind her ear and told her that nobody was taking anyone anywhere, that she only needed to stay right behind him. Then he stood, pulled in a careful breath, and opened the front door. The cold morning air rushed into the house. From the very first car, an old man stepped out. Caleb recognized him at once. It was the same elderly gentleman who, the night before, had stood quietly at the cashier's counter of a fine downtown restaurant, while a manager humiliated him in front of a room full of strangers. It was the same man whose meal Caleb had paid for with the last cash in his wallet. But this morning, the old man did not look poor at all. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and polished leather shoes. His silver hair was combed neatly back. Beside him stood a young woman in her late 20s, her chestnut hair falling softly over the collar of a long black coat. Beneath the coat, a white dress with a clean V neckline gave her the look of someone who knew exactly how much power she carried into every room. She stepped forward and spoke first. "Mr. Morgan," she said. "Last night you paid for my grandfather's meal. This morning we have come to repay a much larger debt." Caleb stood at his own threshold and forgot how to speak. Lily peeked out from behind him, tugged at her father's sleeve, and whispered that the gentleman in the suit was the same man who had eaten soup at their table. To understand why 20 luxury cars had come to a poor man's door at sunrise, the story must reach back exactly 18 hours, to a moment when Caleb Morgan still had only a few crumpled bills folded in his wallet. 18 hours earlier, Caleb was lying half under a humming compressor unit behind a small bakery on the west side of town. The bakery owner, a tired man in his 50s named Howard, kept stepping into the alley to ask how much longer the repair would take. Caleb did not snap at him. He simply went on checking each line, each fuse, each fitting. When the compressor finally hummed itself back to life, he wiped his hands on a rag and stood up. Howard pressed a creased envelope into his palm. Caleb opened it, counted, and found the amount short by nearly half. Howard explained that the month had been harder than expected and promised the rest of the money by the following week. Caleb stayed quiet. The rent on the small wooden house was already past due. The truck had been making a clicking sound that he did not like. Lily's shoes were too tight. But when he looked at Howard, at the worn shoes and the trays of unsold pastries through the bakery window, he simply folded the envelope and nodded. "Next week is fine," Caleb said. "But please, pay the rest. I have a little one at home." He drove the old pickup through gray afternoon traffic and stopped at a small pharmacy. Lily had been getting over a cold for nearly a week, but she still coughed at night. He picked up the smallest bottle of cough syrup he could find, and by the time the cashier handed him his change, he understood that whatever remained in his wallet would barely cover a single modest meal. And at home, Lily had spread crayons across the living room floor. She was finishing a careful drawing of two stick figures sitting at a small round table. There was a tiny cake between them. Caleb knelt beside her and recognized at once what she had drawn. Her 6th birthday had passed 3 days earlier. On the actual day, he had been across town crawling under a walk-in cooler at a sandwich shop that paid by the hour. "If it costs too much," Lily said quietly, without looking up, "we can have noodles at home, Daddy." Caleb felt the words land somewhere behind his ribs. He knelt fully on the carpet and took her small face gently in his hand. He told her that he had promised her a real birthday dinner, and that tonight she was going to have one. The restaurant, called the Silver Fork, sat near the heart of downtown Cleveland, 3 blocks from the river, its tall glass doors framed by warm amber sconces. It belonged to a chain owned by a hospitality group with a name carved in gold above the entrance, but to Caleb and Lily it might as well have been a palace. Lily took her father's hand the moment they stepped inside, her eyes widening at the chandeliers, at the white linen tablecloths, at the soft hum of jazz drifting from speakers. A young hostess moved toward them with a kind smile, but a man with a sharp jaw and oiled side part stepped in first. His name tag said Brandon Pierce, and the title beneath his name said General Manager. He took one slow glance at Caleb's sleeves, at the small scuff on his work boots, at Lily's slightly faded ribbon, and his lips formed a thin, polite line. He did not turn them away. Instead, he murmured something to the hostess, who lowered her eyes and led the two of them to a small table near the side hallway, far from the soft glow of the central dining room. Caleb noticed. He had spent enough years standing in service entrances of fancy places to know the difference between a center table and a hallway table. But he saw the way Lily was leaning forward, taking in everything around her with the quiet joy of a child who rarely sat in rooms with chandeliers. He pulled out her chair the way a gentleman would. She opened the menu carefully, her finger going straight to the price column. She studied the numbers for a long moment, then pointed to the cheapest dish on the page. "I can have this one, Daddy," she said. Caleb gently pushed the menu back toward her. "Tonight is your birthday dinner, sweetheart. You do not have to pick the cheapest thing just to look after me." She lifted her eyes to his. "But what if you run out of money?" He smiled, though something behind his ribs ached. He told her that if it came to that, he would figure it out. Her job tonight, he said, was to be a 6-year-old, not her father's accountant. When the food arrived, Lily closed her eyes and made a small wish over a slice of berry tart that her father had quietly ordered as a surprise. She whispered it softly, but Caleb caught the last words. She had wished that her daddy would not have to be so tired anymore. He turned his face slightly toward the window so she would not see what passed through his expression. Outside, a thin rain had begun to fall. And at the cashier's counter near the front of the restaurant, a different voice began to rise. The voice belonged to Brandon Pierce. At first it was almost professional, almost pleasant, the kind of tone he used to make every confrontation sound like procedure. He stood across the counter from an elderly man in a worn brown coat, a faded woolen scarf, and shoes still flecked with mud from the rain outside. The old man's hands trembled faintly as he tried to hold a small leather wallet. He had ordered nothing extravagant. A bowl of hot soup, a slice of warm bread, a cup of plain tea. His credit card had just been declined. The old man, whose name no one yet knew was Henry Whitmore, did not raise his voice. He apologized softly, said the machine might be having a problem, and asked if the cashier might try it again. The young employee at the register glanced at Brandon, clearly uncomfortable. Brandon stepped in at once, the way he always did when he sensed an audience. "Sir, Brandon said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the surrounding tables. "We cannot serve a guest who is unable to settle the bill." Henry Whitmore lowered his head and said, almost in a whisper, that he could leave his old watch as collateral and return the next day to pay in full. Brandon glanced down at the worn timepiece on the old man's wrist and let out a short, sharp laugh. He said he was not sure that would even cover a linen napkin in his establishment. Two diners at a nearby table laughed under their breath. A man in a gray suit looked away with the small smile of someone who did not want to be seen laughing, but did not want to interrupt either. Brandon felt the air shift in his favor, and like a man who only knew how to perform when others were watching, he raised the volume of his voice another notch. He said this was not a place where people walked in expecting a free meal. He said there were churches outside, shelters 2 blocks over, and that the old man had come to the wrong door. Henry Whitmore did not argue. He did not protest. He simply lowered his head a little further. And it was that silence, that small respectful bowing of an old man's shoulders, that made the scene unbearable to watch. Brandon turned to a uniformed security guard standing near the entrance. He told the guard to escort the gentleman out through the service door so as not to ruin the evening for the paying guests. A woman in pearls at the table closest to the counter murmured to her husband, just loud enough to be heard, that some people simply did not know their place. At the small table by the side hallway, Caleb had stopped eating. Lily's fork had frozen halfway to her mouth. She did not understand all the words Brandon was using, but she understood the shape of the cruelty in his voice. Caleb closed his hand around the edge of his napkin until his knuckles went pale. A memory rose up before he could stop it. His own father, many years ago, being called a man with dirty hands by a clerk simply for stepping into a store after a long shift, holding a small gift for Caleb's mother in his stained palms. Caleb had been very young then, but he had never forgotten the look on his father's face that day. He did not move at first. He was a father, and fathers learn how to weigh impossible scales. If he stood up and confronted the manager, he might be asked to leave the restaurant in front of his daughter. If anything turned ugly, Lily would be afraid. But Lily looked up at him, her small hand resting on his sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered. "If that was Grandpa, would you let them push him out into the cold?" There was no accusation in her question. There was no scolding. There was only the clear, honest sound of a child who had been listening to everything her father had ever told her about how the world should treat the people inside it. And it was that very honesty that left no room to hide. Caleb looked at his daughter for a long moment. In her eyes, he saw every quiet lesson he had whispered to her at bedtime. Do not laugh at people who are tired. Do not turn away from someone weaker than you. Do not stay silent simply because the room is silent. If he sat where he was tonight, somewhere deep inside her, she would learn that kindness was only a beautiful word, useful when it cost nothing. He could not let her learn that lesson. Caleb placed his napkin on the table. He pulled out his wallet and looked once at the small folded bills inside, and at the worn photograph of Lily at 3 years old, tucked behind the cash. Then he stood up. He moved the way a man moves, when he simply knows the next right thing to do. He walked through the dining room with his daughter's eyes on his back, and stepped up beside the old man at the counter. "How much was his meal?" Caleb asked. Brandon turned. He looked at Caleb's work shirt, at the small grease stain at the cuff, and his eyes narrowed. "With all due respect, sir, this does not concern you." Caleb met his gaze without blinking. "It does now." He reached for his wallet and laid the bills on the polished wood counter one by one. 20. A few singles. A small handful of coins gathered from the cup holder of his truck. It was the last money he had until his next job. He knew that when he stepped out of the restaurant tonight, he would have to skip the small slice of cake he had been planning to surprise Lily with at home. He would have to put off the new pair of shoes she needed for at least another week. He laid the money down anyway. "I'm covering it," Caleb said. Brandon let out a laugh that had nothing pleasant inside it. He asked Caleb whether he was sure, or whether he was about to give him another declined card to deal with in a minute. A small ripple of nervous laughter moved through the dining room. The shame in the air spread sideways now, including Caleb in the same circle as the old man. This was the moment Caleb had braced for. He had not stood up to be a hero. He had stood up knowing that he might be humiliated alongside the very person he was trying to defend. Henry Whitmore spoke for the first time since the scene had begun. "Young man," he said gently, "you do not have to do this." Caleb looked at him. "I know. But you do not have to be spoken to like that either." Brandon tried to recover. "You think paying for one bowl of soup makes you some kind of hero?" Caleb did not answer right away. He looked around the room slowly. He looked at the people in suits, at the gold watches, at the diamond bracelets, at the eyes that turned down to plates so as not to be seen. Then he looked back at Brandon. "No," he said. I just think a bowl of soup should not be an excuse to take a man's dignity away from him." The room went quiet. Brandon's neck reddened. His pride was wounded in front of the very crowd he had been performing for, and so he tried to hit back where he believed Caleb would feel it most. He told Caleb that he hoped he still had enough money left to pay for his daughter's meal. Caleb's gaze grew steady and cold. "My little girl will eat a smaller portion tonight," he said quietly. "But at least she will not grow up to be a man like you." The dining room fell completely silent. A few yards away, Lily was standing now beside her chair, holding her stuffed rabbit by the ear. She did not understand every word, but she understood that her father was protecting someone who had been treated unkindly. Inside the small chest of a 6-year-old, something quietly and permanently took shape. Brandon, embarrassed and furious, accepted the cash and nodded toward the waiter to bring the soup. The waiter set the soup down on a small table near the swinging kitchen door. The lights were dim there, the air heavy with the smell of fryer oil. Caleb watched it happen and understood that Brandon had chosen the table on purpose. He did not raise his voice this time. He simply turned to Lily, who had walked over to stand beside him. "Sweetheart," he asked her softly, "would you mind if the gentleman sat with us?" Lily shook her head at once. She told her father the man could have her bread. Caleb walked over and offered the old man a place at their small table near the window. Henry hesitated, then nodded once and accepted. Lily slid her side plate across to him without a word. Caleb cut his own portion of meat in half and pushed the better part toward his daughter. He simply made the sacrifice the way he had made so many others over the past 4 years. Henry watched it all. He asked Caleb what kind of work he did. Caleb said he repaired refrigeration units and kitchen systems. Henry asked if he often helped strangers the way he had helped him that night. Caleb shook his head with a small, tired smile. "I cannot help every time," he said. "But my daughter's watching tonight." Henry turned to Lily. "You have a good father," Lily answered without a beat. "Daddy gets tired a lot. But he is not mean to anybody." The simple sentence seemed to weigh more than every chandelier in the room. An old man, who had built much of his life on the principle that the way a person treats a stranger is the truest mirror of their soul, sat across from a 6-year-old who had just said exactly that without any practice. Henry asked Caleb his full name. Caleb hesitated, because he had no wish to be thanked. But Henry quietly explained that he simply wanted to remember the name of the person who had let him sit at a table like a human being. Caleb Morgan Dash. Henry's eyes lingered on him. "Do you know who I am, son?" Caleb shook his head. "No, sir, but I know you did not deserve to be spoken to that way." Henry took out a small notebook from the inside of his coat. He wrote down the name, and beneath it the cross street that Caleb had mentioned earlier, when he had been telling Lily how soon they would be home. He folded the page carefully and slid it back into his pocket. When he stood to leave, Brandon was standing near the entrance, polishing a wine glass with deliberate slowness. Brandon could not resist one final remark as Henry walked by. He told the old man to check his wallet next time before walking into a place like this. Henry stopped. He did not look angry. He only looked at Brandon with eyes that had seen a great many years of working men, of cooks, of dishwashers, of customers. "Tomorrow," he said, you will understand how expensive a bowl of soup can be." Brandon laughed. He believed he was looking at an old man trying to hold on to a small piece of his pride. Outside the restaurant, the rain had slowed to a soft mist. Caleb wrapped his jacket around Lily's shoulders as they hurried to the truck. She slipped her small hand into his and asked if he was sad about spending the money. He opened the passenger door for her and told her that he was not sad about the money. He was sad, he said, because so many people in that restaurant had seen something wrong and stayed in their chairs. Now the story returns to the morning and to the 20 black luxury cars lined along a quiet residential block in Cleveland. Caleb stood at his front door with Lily half tucked behind him. Henry Whitmore took one slow step closer, but not so close as to crowd the family. He inclined his head respectfully toward Caleb and apologized for frightening the little girl. He said he had not come to cause trouble. Scarlett Whitmore stepped forward beside him. She looked at Caleb with the focused regard of an executive who had just recognized a person worth her full attention. "My name is Scarlett Whitmore," she said. "I am the chief executive of Whitmore Hospitality Group, and this is my grandfather, Henry Whitmore, the founder of our company." Caleb stood, very still. The old man who had been called a beggar the night before was the man who owned the entire hospitality chain to which the Silver Fork belonged. Scarlett went on calmly and clearly. For several months, her grandfather had been quietly visiting his restaurants in plain clothing, sometimes with no money in his pocket at all, sometimes with cards that he had asked the bank to temporarily decline. On paper, the company was thriving, but Henry believed that the people who could give nothing back were being treated as if they were nothing. The night before, he had visited the Silver Fork to find out whether his suspicion was correct. Caleb looked at the old man. "So you wanted them to think you had nothing to give?" Henry nodded. "I wanted to know what kind of people my company had become when they thought no one was watching." Lily stepped out from behind her father, still clutching the rabbit, and looked up at the old man. She wanted to know if he had finished his soup. Henry knelt slowly, his knees stiff against the porch step. He smiled, and for a moment he was not the founder of a chain, nor a man with a fleet of cars. He was simply a grandfather kneeling to speak to a child. He told her that he had finished it, and that it had been the best bowl of soup he had eaten in many years. Scarlett looked at Lily then. She had spent the past few years learning to read balance sheets and to dismiss underperforming managers. But she had not been prepared for the way a small voice could reach across the space of a porch and remind her that she had inherited not only a company, but a meaning. She turned back to Caleb. "We would like you and your daughter to come with us to the Silver Fork this morning. There is something we intend to do publicly, and we would like you to be present." Caleb shook his head at once. "I do not want her dragged into a grown-up business." Scarlett did not argue. "I understand. But your daughter watched an old man be humiliated last night. Perhaps it would mean something for her to see that wrongdoing is not allowed to stand without consequence." Lily tugged at Caleb's hand. She said softly that if the bad man was still at the restaurant, another grandpa would be pushed away too. Caleb closed his eyes for a moment. His daughter, once again, had quietly guided him toward the right answer. He nodded. In the back seat of a long black sedan, Caleb sat with one arm around Lily while she pressed her face against the window. Scarlett sat across from them, listening more than speaking. He had not asked for compensation. He had not hinted at favors. The only thing he had asked, before the car began moving, was whether his daughter would be expected to appear in front of cameras. Scarlett had answered that she would not allow the little girl to be turned into a story. When the convoy of 20 cars rolled to a stop in front of the Silver Fork, the entire staff inside the building scrambled. Through the tall front windows, the morning light fell on Brandon Pierce, who was inspecting wine glasses with the same satisfied tilt of the chin he had worn the night before. He saw the row of luxury cars pulling up to the curb and lifted his shoulders, expecting a wealthy private booking. He smoothed his tie. He moved toward the door with the well-practiced smile of a man who believed he was about to charm a roomful of investors. The smile collapsed on his face when Henry Whitmore stepped onto the sidewalk. For a long moment, Brandon did not recognize him. The tailored suit, the polished shoes, the calm, dignified bearing. Then Henry removed his glasses and met his eye, and Brandon's stomach turned over inside him. He remembered the old man. He remembered the soup. He remembered the words about churches and shelters. But he also saw the bodyguards, the legal counsel, the chief executive, and he understood, in the slow horror of a man who has watched his own foot crush something far more important than he realized, that he had made an enormous mistake. Scarlett walked up the steps. Her tone, when it came, was even. "Mr. Pierce, last night you told my grandfather that he had come to the wrong door. This morning, we are here to determine who has actually walked into the wrong place." Brandon's mouth opened, but no useful sound came out. Inside the restaurant, the staff stood in a long, quiet row along the dining room wall. The breakfast crowd had been politely asked to step into a private lounge while the executive team handled an internal matter. The young hostess from the night before stood near the kitchen door with her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Scarlett did not raise her voice. She simply asked an assistant to bring up the security footage on the large interior screen used for staff training. Brandon began to speak, the way men do when they hope to outpace the truth. He explained that the previous evening had been a misunderstanding. He said the old gentleman had appeared confused. He said he had only been trying to protect the experience of paying guests. The screen lit up. The dining room of the night before came alive in full color. Henry Whitmore at the cashier's counter. Brandon Pierce raising his voice. Diners turning to watch. A security guard summoned. Caleb Morgan rising from his chair. Brandon laughing as Caleb laid down the bills. Brandon's own voice, captured clearly by the security microphone, telling the staff that they should not ruin the evening for the paying guests. The recording paused on that line. Scarlett did not point at the screen. She did not need to. "Mr. Pierce, what exactly was ruining the experience of the paying guests that evening? An elderly man asking for soup, or your cruelty toward him?" Brandon's mouth moved without sound. He fell back on the same patterns. Pressure. Standards. The reputation of the brand. Demanding clientele. Henry Whitmore stepped forward. He spoke quietly, but every person in the room listened. He told them how his own mother had run a small diner near a steel plant where she served hot soup to the men who came off the night shift. He had built Whitmore hospitality on a single stubborn principle. The person who walks through the door is a guest, not a wallet. He had not built fine dining rooms so that crisp napkins and amber lighting could be used as costumes for the cruelty of men who like to look down on the poor. "I am not ashamed that I was mistaken for a poor man last night," Henry said. "I am ashamed that my own manager believed a poor man did not deserve to be spoken to kindly." Scarlett laid a folder on the table. Brandon had a history. He had refused service to a construction crew on a hot summer afternoon. He had ordered staff to seat plainly dressed customers behind decorative dividers. He had instructed a security guard to follow an elderly woman through the dining room because she had walked in carrying a worn handbag. Brandon's color drained. "Mr. Pierce, your employment is terminated, effective immediately. All complaints you have concealed will be turned over to the Legal and Human Resources departments. If discrimination or abuse of authority is confirmed, we will follow it to the proper end." Brandon, desperate now, turned his glare toward Caleb. He hissed that all of this had come from one bowl of soup, and asked if Caleb was satisfied. Caleb met his eyes without anger or pleasure. "No. You destroyed your own career when you assumed nobody would ever stand beside the weaker man." The young hostess began to cry quietly. She stepped forward and admitted in a small, uneven voice that she had wanted to speak out many times against Brandon, but she had been afraid of losing her job. Henry told her gently that fear would not be punished, but that silence would no longer be allowed to protect what was wrong. When the doors of the dining room reopened, the morning light streamed through the tall windows and spilled across the polished floor. Henry guided Caleb, Lily, and Scarlett to the central table, the same one that the night before had been reserved for the wealthiest customer of the evening. The night before, he and his daughter had been quietly tucked into the corner near the hallway. This morning, the very same family was being seated at the heart of the room. Henry placed a thick envelope in front of Caleb. He explained gently that it was a gift, an expression of gratitude. Caleb looked down at the envelope. He thought about the rent. He thought about the truck. He thought about Lily's shoes and the bottle of cough syrup beside the kitchen sink. For a few seconds, the weight of everything he carried pressed against him. Then he glanced at Lily. She was watching him with the same steady eyes she had watched him with the night before. Caleb understood, in that single moment, that how he accepted this gift would teach her something just as deep as how he had stood up for the old man. He gently slid the envelope back across the table. "I am grateful to you, sir. But I do not want my daughter to grow up thinking that kindness is something we sell back to the rich man when he comes looking for it." Henry did not argue. If anything, his admiration deepened. Scarlett spoke then. She did not offer Caleb money. She offered him a position. She wanted him to serve as the Director of Customer Experience and Service Ethics for the Cleveland region of Whitmore Hospitality Group. His task would be to visit the restaurants in the area, to train staff on how to treat every guest with dignity, and to report directly to her on the things that numbers on a balance sheet could never measure. Caleb stared at her. "I am a refrigeration man." Scarlett smiled. "I have plenty of people who can read revenue reports. What I do not have is enough people who can look at an old man being humiliated and understand that the failure belongs to the entire system." Caleb thought about it. He asked only one question. He told her that he still needed time to take his daughter to school and pick her up afterward. Scarlett nodded at once. "We will build a schedule around a father, Mr. Morgan. Not around a man who is expected to pretend he does not have a child." Lily looked up at Scarlett with wide, curious eyes. She wanted to know whether her daddy would still have to work so late at night. Scarlett knelt slightly to meet her gaze and promised the little girl that she would do her best to make sure her father had more dinners at home with her. Caleb felt something he had not felt in a very long time. The feeling of being respected without having to bend. In the months that followed, the Silver Fork was not the same. The staff went through new training. A quiet program began offering warm meals to elderly residents who had nowhere to go for a hot supper, with no photographs, no announcements, no audience for the kindness. Workers in coveralls walked through the front door for lunch and were seated like any other guest. The restaurant remained refined, but stopped being cold. Caleb did not become a wealthy man overnight. He still made Lily's breakfast each morning. He still wore plain shirts to work. But the gnawing pressure of unpaid bills lifted from his shoulders. The truck was repaired. The rent was paid on time. Lily had new shoes. More importantly, Caleb continued raising his daughter on his own terms, with his dignity entirely his own. On a soft, rainy evening many months later, Caleb walked Lily into the Silver Fork after his shift. Scarlett met them at the door, in a simple but elegant V-neck dress. As they prepared to be seated, Caleb noticed something through the front window. A man in his late 60s, in an old jacket, stood outside in the drizzle, counting a small handful of coins in his palm. He hesitated, took a half step toward the door, then stepped back. A young server began to move toward the entrance. Caleb gently rested a hand on the man's shoulder and told him that he would handle this one. Lily followed her father to the door, still holding her stuffed rabbit. She looked up at him and asked softly whether they could invite the man inside for some soup. Caleb looked at his daughter. He did not need to teach her anything anymore. She had already learned. He nodded and told her that no one should have to stand out in the cold simply because they were afraid of being looked down upon. He opened the door, and the warm amber light of the dining room spilled out into the rain. A bowl of soup, after all, can cost only a few dollars. But when it is offered by the right person at the right moment, it can expose the cruelty of the proud, it can awaken the conscience of the powerful, and it can quietly change the future of an entire family.